The sole purpose test, the subject of our session today, is a bit of a sacred cow, really. It's criticised really only in secret and held to be immune from questioning. But is it time for us to reconsider the continued relevance of the sole purpose test? So Section 62 of the SIS Act, oh, we're off to a good start, isn't it exciting? This is where we find the sole purpose test. And to be eligible for tax concessions, super funds must not breach the sole purpose test. Yet most of the case law on this involves self-managed super funds and not APRA-regulated funds. So there's not a lot of certainty and clarity in this area. As the world around us evolves, and as to what might amount to a breach, the questions continue. APRA has never commenced proceedings for a Section 62 breach, ever, nor have they ever required a fund to submit an enforceable undertaking. So to take us on this journey today, we have an esteemed panel of 4 fund CEOs. So Deanne Stewart, immediately to my right, is the CEO of First State Super, a position she's held not all that long. She brings 20 years of experience, however, in financial services covering both superannuation and insurance. Michael Pennisi is the Chief Executive Officer of QSuper, a role he's held since 2015. Michael is also CEO of QSuper's financial planning subsidiary, QInvest Limited, and the life insurance company, QInsure Limited, and he's also a director of AXI. Then David Atkin is the CEO of Cbus. He was also the Australian Asset Owners representative on the PRI board between 2009 and 2015, and he's also currently on the board of Frontier Advisors. And then Vicki Doyle, the CEO of REST, a role that she's held since May 2018. Vicki brings 17 years of senior executive leadership experience in super, life insurance and wealth management, as well as banking. But to get us started, Deanne is kindly going to take us through a brief history lesson on the sole purpose test to make sure that we're all on the same page and setting the context for our discussion. We'll then commence a panel discussion. So please welcome our speakers and welcome Deanne.
Well, thanks very much, Eve. And it's fabulous to see so many of you here for this session. I know when we first spoke about the importance of sole purpose and having a really good debate and discussion around this, it was like, yes, but will anyone come? So it's fabulous to see you all here. What I thought I'd do before we really get into more Q&A is just give you a little bit of context and background to how sole purpose came, just so that we're all on that. Some of you I know will know this inside out, and then others may be newer to it. So just to sort of let you know, I guess, where sole purpose test came from, the traditional obligations of trustees really came out of what was called the Prudent Man Law, and that existed right up till about 1993 when the SIS Act came in. And the SIS Act attempted, and I will use the word attempted, to give a greater definition to the sole purpose of superannuation. So what are trustees' obligations as it relates to member outcomes? And so I'm just going to give you a little snippet of that as it sits in Section 62, as Evie said. And so you can see here, and this is not, by the way, for you to read word for word, it's actually more just to give you a sense. This is only one section of the sole purpose test. The sole purpose test is over 600 words and attempts to give a sense of the purpose. To make it easier for you, essentially what it states, as I said, it pre-existed but then was enshrined in the SIS Act in 1993. And when you think about the history and where that came from, it actually was very defined benefits mindset as this was being set in the SIS Act. And so even in the wording and the understanding of sole purpose, it very much has that in its mindset and how it's written. And it talks at the heart of it of the core purpose being around providing retirement benefits for members and death benefits, once again having come out of that defined benefit mindset, as well as ancillary purposes around insurance and reversionary benefits. So that really is at the heart of what's sitting with sole purpose. But what I would say, and the reason why I think it is good to have a good debate and discussion as an industry and lead the thinking here, is that actually there's a lot of ambiguity, I think, with sole purpose and a lot of different interpretations. In fact, recently with something that we were looking at, we actually got two completely different legal views on a sole purpose on this particular issue because of that ambiguity that relates. What I'd say since 1993 is that a lot has happened in superannuation, and actually what superannuation is today is actually also quite different, and therefore do we need to think about the sole purpose in a different way as well. So if a reminder, back in 1993, the average life expectancy was to 77 years. So if you were retiring at, say, 65 years, it was really thinking about, okay, for the next 10 years or so, you know, we made sure we've stored up enough benefits. It really didn't touch on being in retirement and what's expected, and the fact that life expectancy, for example, during this period has increased significantly at about nearly 85, as you can see, for women, let alone the next decade and the next decade where retirement won't just be a 10-year or now a 20-year, it'll be 30 years, it'll be 40 years. So if we actually set up the sole purpose that really is much more speaking about accumulation and very defined more around the product side. The other thing that's occurred during this time is just the sheer complexity of our system. So 194 APRA-regulated funds, but actually over 40,000 options with choice and self-managed super funds included. We've obviously had also through that time a significant number of regulation changes, with the bigger ones being Simpler Super, Superstream and MySuper. But obviously every year there's been tinkering with the system, adding complexity. Now, in a way that still should be pretty simple in accumulation, but come retirement there is much complexity there. And none of that really is addressed by sole purpose. Add to that, we still, as an industry, haven't landed on the superannuation objective. Now, as close to that we came is with the bill, the draft superannuation bill from 2016, but actually even if you read those words, it actually takes quite a fiscal approach to it. I think AIST at that time really attempted to give a broader definition to superannuation in terms of the objective. And I think what's really important here when you think about superannuation and the objective of superannuation is that it really should speak to adequacy, sustainability and fairness and intergenerational fairness in its objective. And I think therefore we wanted to really open up this debate and discussion around, well, what is the purpose of superannuation and what is the objective of superannuation? And just finally, before we open up, a couple of reasons to also consider for reviewing sole purpose is members' best retirement outcome does depend on many different things, not just the investment return, but also decisions made throughout their life that actually can really alter the member outcome. Advice, for example, depending on a person's circumstances, where you take into account their house, the superannuation and the age pension, can have a life-altering impact on a member's outcome. And the other thing is, when you think about the purpose, it needs to support best member interest. You've got long-term returns required with low fees, but also what will have a bearing on the best outcome will be the right product and the right service to suit their needs, protection for members and the dependents should the worst happen, and a really easy experience. And that's how you can see the superannuation industry evolving as to what is super. But none of that is really defined or was defined back in 1993. So that's hopefully just to give you a little bit of context, and then I'll hand it over to Evie to run the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanne. Hopefully my microphone's working again now. So I might start with you, Vicki, and I just remind you all that the Q&A is open on the app, so I'll be looking for your questions shortly. Vicki, Rest recently launched a vitality program. How does that sit with the sole purpose test, and how did the debate between marketing and legal get resolved on that one?
Okay, well, firstly, we love our legal team. They're a very important part of our whole team. And if I just provide a bit of context, as Deanne mentioned, whilst the sole purpose test, in my view, and is there for providing benefits upon retirement or if the beneficiary dies, in fact, we've already seen this extended through insurance, through super, income protection. We've seen it through providing advice, through super and education and the like. Now, I think that raises a really important question, and it's very central, and that is, like Deanne mentioned, super does not operate in a vacuum. In order to maximise a member's outcome in retirement, it's dependent on someone's ability to earn a wage for as often and as much as they can throughout their entire life. And to earn an income, among many things, you need to be healthy and well. But that's a pretty big concept for everyday Aussies who are under everyday life pressures. And it's not until something goes wrong for a member that those things start to really become very clear. When you lose your ability to earn an income, you certainly know all the ramifications of that. So I do believe it's up to us as funds to look out for the holistic needs of our members right throughout all of their lives. So modest expenditure on engagement with members helps them connect the dots, and I think it will maximise their retirement incomes, which is often too far and too long away for them to even picture what that means. So from a fund perspective, I think that means that we're the custodians of our members' future lives. And that's quite a big concept, but it's a really important concept. That's what we need to be thinking about. So for Rest, we did launch Vitality last year. It's a health and wellbeing program run by and supported by our insurer, AIA Australia. And it incentivised participants to get active and improve their health. It's linked to other devices like the Fitbit and the like. It manages their nutrition, their sleep, their activity, and then it rewards them with anything like $5 Boost Juice vouchers to fitness club discounts and a whole raft of things that rewards them for actually achieving health and wellbeing. We built it into the Rest app. And the reason we did that is, back to my original point, you know, if you're well and you're healthy, you can continue to earn an income, which means you can continue saving for a retirement and your future self. So putting the linkage between super and health and insurance into an app means that it's very much easier for a member to see how those things are connected. Obviously, for younger members, it makes it much more relevant to the here and now. And we see people logging into their app on average 6 times a month rather than 4. Now, the reason that's really important is because we find when not just young members, but any members who interact with their app actually understand their super and their insurance at a much higher rate than any other one of the channels. So I think, importantly, if all of the super funds were helping all Australians stay healthy and well, continue to earn an income means that we would continue to actually help people achieve their best retirement.
And did you have any interaction with the regulator when you were, testing the idea of Vitality?
It was probably a little bit before my time,
right?
And the teams have not highlighted that as being a significant blocker or challenge. So I suspect we managed that through ourselves.
Okay, all right. Michael, CEO of QSuper, but also QInvest and QInsure. Some say that your fund has pushed the envelope on the sole purpose test maybe more than most. How has the fund navigated the sole purpose test in setting up both the financial planning business and the life insurance business?
Thank you, Eva, and what a lovely first question.
Let's get straight into it.
Good morning, everyone. A couple of things. So my simple answer is really carefully, really methodically, work with the board and, work with the regulator from day dot. That has been a real important part of what we've done. What's really interesting, you've made the comment in the question, I thank you again for that, that we may have pushed the envelope. Do you know that one criticism we have internally is that we believe that we're over-conservative?
Right.
Which is really interesting, isn't it? So, okay, so I'll go back. So to me, provision of advice in insurance is really uncontentious. So the basic premise for QInvest, so that's our advice business, that was 25 years old last month. So I'm going to go back in time. So the basic premise for that was that we wanted to provide our members with great advice, great value, also without conflict of remuneration, without conflict of structure, without conflict of culture. That is what the trustee board at that time was talking about. And the reason they were talking about that is because we're going back 25 years, is QSuper members were leaving. They were leaving with very large balances, often defined benefit balances, and they didn't know what to do. So I've gone back over time, and people were putting their money in a bank account. People were being targeted by other intermediaries and institutions, and the powers that be at the time, I wasn't at QSuper then, said, you know, there's got to be a better way. Our members, we need to look after them. We need to do all the things I said. It might be more worthwhile if I talk about QInsure, because that's much more recent. So QInsure, a very different birth. So in about 2015 or so, the federal government changed the law. We were self-insuring a lot of our members. We'd been doing it for about 30 years. The law changed and said we couldn't do it anymore. So the first port of call that we went to wasn't to create an insurance company, I can assure you. It was go out to the market and tender. And we did that twice because we felt the answer was not build it. That wasn't the first place we started. It was go to the market. Can the market solve the need that we had for our members? We went out twice to tender, and I'll really shortcut this. And what came back over a couple of iterations was, we won't insure your police or emergency services workers. You can imagine how that went down. They are such important people in our communities. They're very important members to us. And to be really frank, we felt the premiums that were going to be charged, we couldn't live with, if I put it as simple as that. And it came on a Friday afternoon after we received the responses from the tenders again. I was in my office and I was with who's now my EGM of Strategy, Glenn Hipwood, and we were a bit glum. We were thinking, what are we going to do? We don't like the premiums, we don't like the terms and conditions that the market's offering, but we've got to do this. We've got a deadline. And we had a deadline that was immovable. And it was a simple question that Glenn asked. He said, do you reckon we could do it? We went, well, we should have a look at it. That very, very simple question started about 9 to 12 months of work that I really don't want to have to do again, to be perfectly honest. And I'll tell you really quickly how we went about it. So from a very simple question, could we do it? We then had to do a case for the board. We had to then get the right experts on board to say, okay, if we were going to do it, what was involved? The first port of call was exactly what Deanne put up on the slides, the sole purpose test. Can we do it? We reckon and we believe that we could do a big tick on it's in members' best interest. We always start there, end of story. Then it came down to could we actually do it? So we obviously got lots of lawyers involved, risk and compliance were involved, and we didn't just go through the motions, we tested it. I remember the arguments that we had around a table to make sure, because there was no way I was going to take, I was head of strategy, chief of strategy at the time, there was no way I was going to take this to the CEO and then argue it to the board, which I ended up doing, unless I believed in it and we could do it. The other thing that we did is we got onto the regulator really, really quickly, and we worked hand in glove with APRA. And I've got to give it to APRA. They worked so hard with us. They didn't always agree with us, and I can remember many trips to Sydney and them coming up many times where we had some quite robust differences of opinion, but that's their job. But what they did do was they committed to making decisions to meet the deadline, and they made those decisions. It was added complexity. This was the first time a super fund had ever created a life insurance company. It's still the only super fund that has a life insurance company, so it was new ground for everyone concerned. So once we had it lined up that it was the right thing to do, we had the regulator saying, you can do it. There was never, you you will, and we'll give it a tick off. It was, you can do it. Then it was, we had to satisfy ourselves it was in the best interests of members. And that test comes up a couple of different limbs. Financially, was it the best thing for our members? And terms and conditions, let's keep it really simple. The QSuper product was separately priced by externals. QSuper as a company and as an offer had to compete as if it was an external fund, an external insurer. And it did. I'll tell you what, clearly it did, because we put it into motion. The board then had to formally decide that it was going to take on QSuper as a company or as an insurer. Then the board had to satisfy itself that it satisfied the sole purpose test, board fiduciary duties, arm's length provision, in-house asset provisions, all of those things. It stacks up from a member benefit, it stacks up that it's going to add value. Can we do it? And what do we have to do to make sure that it was going to comply? And that's where all the things about how this company was set up, it has an independent board, the funding structures have set up, and QSuper, and this is probably the most important point that I'll finish on, sole purpose test is not a point in time test. Everything you do, everything we do, every single day, it has to meet that test, not just when you put it in place. So for QSuper, there are many, many tests. There are return on capital tests. There are premium tests. It will go out to tender itself, and it must go out to tender. It is reviewed by an independent board. It is reviewed by the QSuper board on a quarterly basis. And the board makes decisions in concert with, but separate to, or as the parent entity of QSuper as well. But it has a very independent, I can't emphasise enough, it has a very independent QSuper board as well.
Okay. So Deanne, First State Super had a very different approach. You went out and bought an asset, you bought State Plus. So what was the thinking behind, First State Super making that acquisition, and were any of the elements of thinking similar to Michael's?
There's some real similarities, and in fact, actually, there's a chart, if you don't mind popping the chart on, or I can click. Do you mind putting the chart? Maybe I'll just... there we go. Thank you. I think, given, and I really love that word, custodians to a member's retirement. When you think about retirement, I think as an industry, we acknowledge that we've probably been much more accumulation focused than retirement focused, and that is quickly changing. But also, even when we have conversations about retirement, they tend to be quite product orientated, and we obsess about SIPPers and this and that, and I think it's led often by product manufacturers. But let's not forget that the difference that a member can have in their retirement can be very much dictated by actions that they take, or help and guidance and advice from quality advisors, and the difference that they can make. So while this is just one example, by the way, we have myriad of examples, and actually since joining, I've sat in on many of the financial planning meetings, and State Plus really specialises on advice for everyday Australians, your nurses, your teachers, your police officers, your fireys. And they have got just the most beautiful way of working with those members and really helping them work out what are they wanting in retirement and how to add value to that. And as I said earlier, that's a combination not just of super, but how do you maximise age pension, particularly for this cohort, and your house in all of that, and what's the right combination for you. And so this is an example. As I said, there are many, many examples where it was a real couple that came in literally just as the GFC was occurring, and their view was that they needed to just simply go in the balanced option, and actually even that they weren't quite sure was that the right thing to do. And the red line actually shows that if they'd gone into that balanced option and continued with their spending habits as they thought that they would do, that's what would have happened over this next 10 years and how their balance would have been depleted. The blue line is actually what happened with them, where they came in every year and checked in and actually got really good And by the way, it was the actions they took, not just the advisor, both in terms of what they wanted to put in cash and balance that out, but also what they were doing with their spending habits and how they were using their age pension. And in the end, the blue line is actually what's occurred versus what they would have done without any advice. Now, you can pick a multitude of different examples, but my point here is actually the outcome for a member can be altered quite dramatically with help, the right help and guidance and advice. So if we think about that under the role of a trustee to provide the best outcome possible, I think advice and how we help our members is equally important in the equation as the product or the fund. And that's sort of where First State Super came at it and why they felt actually really getting great help and advice. We want to be known for that, particularly for the vocational workers that we've got as members.
Okay, thank you. David, I want to talk to you about some very different interests to insurance and financial planning that Cbus has. So Cbus Property, obviously very visible right around the country, and thank you for keeping up the building. How's that investment structured, and how have you coped with the sole purpose test there? But then I also want to ask about ME and the new Daily, which Cbus is a part owner of. You know, ME you've had for a very long time, New Daily not quite so long. Were there any tension points in looking at making those investments?
Okay. So Cbus Property it has been very successful for the fund. It was established in 2006. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of the fund. It has its a separate board and a separate management. That board is made up of Cbus appointed directors, but also directors that are appointed with property and development expertise. It must be chaired by one of those independent directors, and no decision of that board can be made without the support of the independent directors. And it would be true to say that it's been an incredibly successful venture for Cbus. Since 2006, the average return of Cbus Property has been 16.15% per annum. Outstanding. That has come about as a result of our insight and experience in the industry. But I mean, ultimately, that proposition was developed because there was a view that we could take that insight we had into our own industry and create investment performance for our members. So that initiative has been very much driven by an investment belief and an investment strategy. It would also be true to say that it also has ancillary or additional benefits around employment. It's created 90,000 jobs, direct jobs, over the time of Cbus Property. And we know that when we do research with our members, they say they love the idea that they are contributing to a fund that takes their money and invests part of it back into their industry, that creates great returns but also creates employment for their industry, is a very compelling part of, I think, the brand of the fund. Now, it's also true to say that that successful model was, it took some time, it's before my time, but we were in the development space, and it wasn't until we got the governance right and the right expertise that we truly started to get these types of results. And there was a lot of learnings in the previous period, but we've been very, very satisfied with what Cbus Property has provided, and we think it's got a very big future going forward. But there's clearly a relationship between the purpose of Cbus Property and the sole purpose test in our minds. In terms of members' equity and the new Daily, members' equity was an investment based on an investment lens. The view was having a customer-centric bank has the potential to be disruptive and also to create a point of difference that would enable investment returns to be achieved for the fund. And clearly it's a very difficult industry, the banking industry, but we also believe having a banking licence also gives us optionality as the industry matures, and having a direct relationship with a bank, potentially from a retirement product perspective, also gives us some opportunity to innovate that we think's consistent with our sole purpose test. The new Doyle is different. It's not an investment. We viewed it as a marketing and member engagement opportunity. We were looking for ways that we could provide or find a way that we could engage with our members. We know that superannuation is a low engagement product. We know that financial literacy is patchy, and that if we could create a vehicle where there was a daily communication with our members that was creating a connection between them and their fund, and was also providing the opportunity for us to talk to them about superannuation, that would enable them to be more informed and to make better decisions about their retirement. And so it was on that basis. But both of those, again, we've been careful to make sure that we're comfortable that it sits within our fiduciary responsibilities and within the sole purpose test. One other comment, just a general comment, and I think this came out of the Royal Commission, which was that the Royal Commission underscored the importance of having really thorough processes, which I think been illustrated today, to demonstrate that you've gone through an evaluation process in the setting up of these vehicles. But more than that, there needs to be an ongoing and thorough process of evaluation once the vehicles are established, to make sure that you're continuing to get the value and monitoring these vehicles that we've been talking about this morning.
Okay. So let's talk about then the relevance of the test going forward. Vicki, REST is known for having a lot of young members. Do you think they really separate superannuation from the rest of financial services?
I think in terms of the sole purpose test, it is as relevant as it's ever been if providing benefits upon retirement means engaging with members right throughout their life to help them maximise their outcomes. In terms of younger people, I've got polar views on this one. In the first instance, a lot of younger members will see it as separate. And unfortunately, they'll see it as a negative on their payslip. They'll go in and enter the workforce and they'll see minus something, and there goes some of what they think might be their income because they don't necessarily have the understanding of how it works. To an institution they may not even yet have a relationship with. So that is something that we need to contend with. But I was also part of a focus group a couple of years ago where something, when you have an event that just strikes you with a young group, and one of the uni students said to me, we said, well, what do you think of your super? And he said, I love my super. And I thought, oh my God, we're not paying him for this. Why did he say this? He said, because I open up my bank app and I've got all these accounts and they're always very low balances or negative, and I'm trying to work out how to live day to day, and it stresses me out. But my super in there has a balance and it's continuously growing. In fact, it's a couple of $1,000, and it makes me actually feel like not all is lost. And so in that app and connecting in that way, he has actually seen himself some more valuable than what he might have thought about in terms of his day-to-day stresses. And that was a really important insight for me. It's just, I'd love that we could bottle that attitude and bottle that opportunity for everybody, because he really got it. But as I said earlier, I think that linking between the health and wellbeing within the app, we've got 42,000 users who 60% of them are using it in an active way, to me means that they can start to get meaningful benefits now that then helps tie them into their future selves. So I think that it is relevant and it's important for young people.
So one of the issues that obviously comes up a lot in relation to the sole purpose test is ESG risk considerations. David, you're on the PRI board. Are ESG factors so far intertwined with long-term value now, or do we still have a long way to go? Is the sole purpose test, the interpretation of it? I guess APRA said a few things about climate change, for example, now as being a valid investment risk consideration. What do you think?
I think this debate's, I'll be honest with you, I think this debate's moved on.
Good.
Seriously, I mean, when you have ASIC, you have APRA, and this week we've had the Reserve Bank, all talk about the material impact climate change, for example, could have on financial markets and on companies that we invest in, on the community more generally, and that institutions really do need to apply their mind to mitigation and adaptation if we are to stay within a 2-degree increase. It's very clear the signals they're sending to the industry. But also there's been plenty of in the last sort of 5 years, legal advice that has made clear that there is a fiduciary responsibility for you to understand what are all the material risks that are potentially impacting your investments, and that environmental, social and governance risk factors can be material and need to be assessed when you are thinking about where you deploy your capital. So frankly, trustees that are not thinking about ESG risks and opportunities are not performing their fiduciary responsibilities, in my view, but it's not just my view. I think that the legal status of this is now very, very clear.
Anyone disagree with David?
No.
No?
No, I don't disagree. The rub, and I'll be very frank, the rub is the balance between wanting to invest for the long term and doing it for the return stream you're going to get, versus the amount of weight you put on ESG factors. I don't think they can be separated, but to be perfectly frank, at the moment, the first port of call is on the return stream.
David, retort?
Well, I mean, I think, so returns, I mean, our job is to achieve our investment return objectives over the short, medium and long term. And there's no point, frankly, in investing in opportunities that are going to, in our view, we're looking for long-term value creation, because we're actually investing for the for horizons around 40 or 50 years, and we are investing generationally. So, we're interested in not short-term profiting, that, if something blows up, make a bit of money, it blows up, and, what's the point of that? If you can find better, longer-term propositions that you've got conviction are going to be sustainably profitable, that's a much better position to be in. And this is where the ESG elements, I think, are important, that you are having a broader assessment about what impacts an investment that historically we've not done as well. But I think the industry is getting much better at that, and we need to.
I agree.
Oh, lovely. I don't have to send you both outside to sort it out. So impact investing, it's often said that the biggest stumbling block to an impact investment is the sole purpose test, that and the size of the investment. Deanne, impact investing is something that First State Super is known to be interested in. Do you think there's a sole purpose test problem?
No, I don't. And I think it's back to the point I think, Michael, you were raising, which is ultimately you are there to help provide the best return for members in the long run, right? And it is in the long run. And that is the beauty of superannuation, in that we can be long-term thinking. So I think with that in mind, then the ability to say, and with that, are there ability to actually have a really positive impact on society? And where are the areas where you can get that jewel? Then actually that's a win-win, and that's certainly the approach that we take. And there are plenty of opportunities that people have asked us to look at where actually you're not getting that jewel, that it is just the impact investing without the return, and we are polite in saying thank you but no thank you. But actually where you can actually have both, wow, that is just superannuation being a force for good, both for the members and for society. And I think that that's a great positive thing about our industry.
Yeah.
So just to give you a couple of examples, by the way, of things that we have looked at. One we're piloting, and it really comes out of members asking us for it. And we're learning with that. One is, say, we've invested in Jobs New South Wales and Jobs Victoria, and how you actually help provide more of a SME community for and finance, and that is going to create positive jobs in those two states. So that very much reflects our member base. But a second one that we are piloting and difficult in this residential market is affordable housing. So that is something that I know probably each of us has been approached on and looked at. And affordable housing, just as affordable housing, probably doesn't reach, in many cases, that hurdle of providing the best member outcome. But where you actually do work with local councils or the government and you actually get certain subsidies, etc., or it's a small percentage of it, but you're able to achieve the affordable housing and the return, well, once again, that's worthy of looking at. And they're things that we're looking at, but always with that, with the sole purpose or the best member outcome in mind.
Okay. So the Royal Commission, Hayne had quite a narrow interpretation of the sole purpose test. He said it was to provide benefits for retirement or in the event of death before retirement, but not post-retirement. So you were talking about, we need to move away from the accumulation phase and think about what happens post-retirement. Do we need to better define what retirement is? I mean, we were talking before about life expectancy back in 1993 being 77. That's no longer the case. Do we need to revisit the retirement focus as opposed to the accumulation focus? What do you think? And does that warrant a change potentially to the sole purpose test?
I'll kick off. Sure. I think we need to do both. I think better describing and articulating retirement and the factors around the household nature of it, even as you lead up into retirement, and that broader set of debt and income and all those trade-offs, and a whole of finances view. I think if we were to better define that, we would actually be able to help members more visually think about accumulation and the trade-offs on all of those things throughout their lives. So I think that by doing those in combination, we actually could help members through accumulation. Otherwise, members will continue to think super is over here and on the side and separate. I'm not sure whether the sole purpose test needs to solve it, but I think, as it was put on the slide, the objective around super is where we could really crystallise this and really take that whole definition piece forward. So I think that would be my preferred approach.
All right. David?
I think, agree with Vicki's comments. I don't think the sole purpose test, it's principles based, and I think it's been broad enough over the history of the superannuation industry for us to evolve. We're maturing as an industry. Our memberships are now starting to age, and the baby boomers are starting to move into retirement, so we're starting to get volumes. And we certainly, when we do the research with our members, they say, look, I'm the expert in my tool of trade, my craft, you're the experts in super. I want you to be on my shoulder through my working life and into retirement, supporting me, nudging me, advising me, getting me the best possible outcome so I can have a retirement with dignity. So our job is not done when they reach retirement. In fact, actually, that is a very hard transition period for people coming out of the workforce, particularly our members, coming out of the workforce where their identity has been into the community. There are a lot of social issues for members in that reorientation. And when we've done the research with our members, they do think we've got a role to play in helping them make that transition, not just from an income perspective, but also as a whole of person perspective. So, we have to think about that very carefully. I think that's less about us potentially being a product provider, with potentially being a trusted advisor where we've done due diligence and we are providing them with reference points for the support that they potentially need in the community. But they trust us to play that role, which I think is something that we should take very seriously, and that's an obligation that weighs heavily, but it's something that's in a very honourable position to be in.
And I think I think this is one of the reasons why I think we're keen to just open up this discussion in many ways and say, does it need updating and does it need clearer guardrails? Because certainly the fact that it doesn't really touch on the responsibilities in retirement is exactly one of those, is exactly the point. To think that we're there to help our members all the way up to transitioning into retirement and then they just sort of disappear or just in one balanced fund and think that that's the best outcome for all of our members, it doesn't feel right. So I think what is the responsibility? What is I agree, the objective of superannuation, and I think it is leading into superannuation, but then there's the responsibility in retirement. And no doubt, exactly, I think things like advice have a real role to play in that, not just the product, as I've mentioned.
I agree with everything that everyone said.
You're very agreeable today.
I'm always agreeable, Eva. I'm always agreeable. But with a twist. With a twist.
Always with a twist.
There's always got to. I always start these thinking about these things. What's the problem we're trying to solve? So I cannot disagree. In fact, I am a wholehearted supporter. I love the trusted advisor. That's exactly what we've been trying to instill for many, many years. But what's the problem we're trying to solve? And when I was thinking about today and thinking about this, this question was likely to come up. So I was thinking, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve? There's nothing that we, and I'm talking about QSuper, thought of doing in the last whatever, that the sole purpose has stopped us doing. So I question, therefore, well, what needs to actually change? I think the post-retirement, which I find interesting because really if you think about post-retirement, it's death because you retire, you're in retirement, then you post it, you died. But let's just keep with the vernacular. Post-retirement, if you looked at conference agendas 10 years ago, there wasn't one word, there was not one session on the what to do in post-retirement decumulation. Every conference now, we're moving towards it. I would say that we need to stop talking about it, we need to deliver. Then it comes down to, I'm always very cautious, and I know this is not what you're suggesting, but I'm very cautious if the answer is change legislation or get it defined in legislation, because it becomes a lawyer's picnic, and specificity, I'll get this right, specificity is the killer of innovation. We need to innovate to do all the things we want to do for members. We, as an industry, have waited for the regulator to tell us what we can or can't do. I don't know about you, but I don't want to work that way, and we don't work that way. We as an industry need to come up with what we think are the areas that we need guidance on. But the answer is not more than 600 words. How many is it, 600? We certainly don't want another 200 words in the sole purpose test.
Okay, so I'm getting the sense that none of the four of you want to narrow the sole purpose test. Michael, am I getting the impression that you think it's fine to remain exactly as it is?
I'm quite happy.
Okay. David?
Yep.
You're quite happy? Vicki?
Yes, I think you've seen the evidence of 4 different funds sitting here and the ways we've all applied that differently. And then if we were to go to all the funds in the room, I think it has given us enough latitude to do. The only caution I would put on that is if the regulators feel compelled to dial up enforcement on post-Hayne, which we know there is pressure to do that, whether the definition puts them in a position that's going to create a higher bar and higher challenges. And so that would be my only caveat, but in the main, I think it's right.
Sorry, David, you go.
Just quickly, I think that's why in a post-Hayne world, the importance of each of us having that ongoing monitoring of what we've set up is really critical here, because you might have got through the gate at the beginning and kind of ticked all the correct boxes, but the world does change, and it's really important that we're continuing to assess those vehicles based on a contemporary assessment of value.
I might get Deanne's answer.
Here's where you might therefore get a little bit of disagreement. I actually think what you've actually heard is that we can come up with very many different versions of sole purpose, and that what are the guardrails and what will be the expectations in 5 or 10 years or in a post-Hayne world? And I think that that's why we're really keen to have the conversation. And whether that's actually changing the sole purpose test or providing really clear guidance, I worry that because it hasn't been tested, and because it is being tested now at the edges, whether you're looking at some of the marketing activity, etc., what is the purpose of superannuation? Do we have at least some clarity that allows some innovation? But actually, at this point, I think you could sit there and not know whether what you've done actually really is a breach or not, because it hasn't been tested. So I think actually much further debate and much further thoughts around what is right, whether that's around the superannuation objective or around the guardrails of the sole purpose, I think we do need, because I think otherwise we'll continue to stretch further and further and not know where the guardrails are.
Michael, you wanted to add something?
So last thing, as I was doing some research, there is a section 62 of the sole purpose test, which actually says that APRA can, by regulation I think, define another ancillary purpose.
Yes.
That hasn't been used, from what I understand.
Okay, so that leads very nicely, thank you, into my next question. So if we don't think, the majority don't think we necessarily need to change the sole purpose test, do we need more regulator guidance?
I'm saying no.
You're saying no.
I think that, no, I'm with Vicki. I think that it's principle-based. I think, there's judgment that's required. You need to develop business cases. As Michael's evidenced, engagement with the regulator can help you work through that. I think that's a healthy way of approaching this, rather than putting out more, regulation around this.
So potentially, stops innovation. Is that what you're worried about, with more guidance?
I just think as an industry, we were talking about the best interest tests, trying to maximise outcome for members in retirement. It is a complex problem to solve, and so many Australians are in so many different sets of demographic, socio-economic positions that when I see policy most recently, and I'll use the one around insurance and super, I think we've looked at things like that through potentially lower North Shore, people who are, good incomes, good families and wealth. We're not thinking regional, and we're not thinking the demographics of people who are not in fortunate positions. So I worry that regulation constrains us from actually understanding the different types of members that we have, the very different socio-demographics that we have, and the actual needs of those members. And to that point, that's why industry funds were created, to help members with a very set of demographics and different sets of needs. And I think regulation just is a bit of a blunt tool at times that says all people look like this, so therefore this will work, and it doesn't.
Yes, and the proposed changes to insurance are a good example of that. Did you want to add anything?
And I never thought I'd be here saying, I think we actually need greater clarity, but I actually do. I really do, because just as what you mentioned, I think is so true with the very different demographics, and that is why you need very different funds that are really focused on that. What I also find is when you get very intelligent people in a room and lawyers in a room, you can also be super creative. And I worry that, and as we saw with advice, when you've actually got such greyness, so many different versions can happen that are good and bad. And I think by providing greater guidance, so for example, we still sit here today and go, is it okay for a super fund to have advisors within their super fund? Well, let's work on how you can structure that so that that can happen, because we all believe in it. But there's not the clarity of that either. And I just think actually, I'm not saying it about necessarily less activities, but I think greater clarity actually would help a number of us to get on and actually spend less time with lawyers, quite frankly, doing what is best for members.
Okay. Michael?
Guidance, yes. Regulation, no.
Right. Okay. All right, might just ask our panellists just for one last final comment that you might want to make about the sole purpose test and what we as an industry need to be doing after today's session.
Well, I might pick up David's point. I think that, and actually Michael made this point as well, keeping that sole purpose test and the purpose of why we are here, and that we've been gifted the opportunity to be the custodians of people's future selves that they yet find often difficult to navigate through, means that in sort of every day and every way you need to continuously test the decisions you make, and that those decisions may have been right a year ago, but things do change. And so I guess even listening to these up here as a panel member, it impresses upon me to continuously keep that lens myself. So that would be my encouragement.
David?
I think that today's panel illustrates the way the industry has turned its mind to problem solving to create solutions that are in the members' best interests. And so long as that applies, I think that we're in a good position to move into the next phase, noting that I think we'll create different solutions as our members' needs change. And I think that we're well placed to do that.
Okay. Michael?
I think we need to, as an industry, spend as much time talking and thinking about culture as we do thinking about things like the sole purpose test. Because everything that came out the Royal Commission was not about law, and the Royal Commissioner said this, it was about culture. So let's join them together.
All right.
And I guess my perspective is I think it is time to have a look at the sole purpose test and update it for 2020 onwards in terms of modern day superannuation funds, and really noting that retirement is as important as accumulation, and being able to have clarity on things like advice, for example.
All right, thank you. I guess we've covered quite a bit of ground in this session today. If internally in your fund you haven't been thinking about these issues, maybe it is worthwhile starting a conversation about the sole purpose test within your fund. Take some of the ideas and discussion points from today's session back with you. AIST would certainly love to hear what you think we should be doing in terms of taking this discussion further. Please thank our speakers for their time and insights today.